actually think in looking at this, it's not that globalization is dead. I think it's just evolving into something different. So whereas in the past you might acquire a competitor to have a position in a particular market, now what we're doing is we're seeing more partnerships where companies are working together but not necessarily acquiring each other. I like to think of M&A as not just being about acquiring other companies, but you can also in that include strategic partnerships and joint ventures and so on.
Hi, Professor Moeller. Thank you very much for accepting our interview. I love reading your book, The Deal Paradox, Mergers and Acquisition Success in the Age of Digital Transformation. The book is fascinating, and in your book, you mentioned that digital transformation has had a profound impact on M&A activities. So nowadays, how should companies adjust their M&A strategies to adapt to the new environment and technology trends?
Great question, but let me first say thank you very much for inviting me to be here and to speak about this particular topic, because it is really a very, very important one with the growth of large language models, LLMs, with the growth of AI, the use of big data and other technologies that are indeed drastically changing the whole M&A market, the way companies approach deals. And it is indeed, I think, essential that companies should now look at the whole process of M&A and working together with buyers and sellers differently because of this digital transformation. And indeed, many companies are already doing that. And I should say it's not just about how you acquire another company's, say, customer base or market share. It's about acquiring the capabilities to be able to do something differently moving forward into the future. And I think businesses need to ask themselves, do we have the technology? Do we have the data? Do we have the talent and the people to keep up with this rapidly changing landscape? Because that's in fact what's necessary. M&A is one of the most important ways that you can actually bridge that gap if you don't have all those capabilities, because you can acquire a company that has some of those capabilities and bring them in very rapidly in a non-organic sense, in an inorganic sense to the company. And I have seen this already, and it's more about, when I speak with companies, about trying to embed a new digital DNA into their organizations. Some companies are technology driven already. They are tech companies. But most companies in the world, their principal function is not technology, but technology will drive what they're doing in the future. As I've said in that book that you mentioned in the introduction, The Deal Paradox, M&A deals are increasingly being driven by the need to acquire digital competencies that enable companies to adapt to a rapidly shifting market demand. You don't have the time to do it organically. You do need to go through the inorganic, the faster process of doing an M&A deal. And the digital deals do allow you to do faster integration. They do allow you to make the decisions quicker. Even with the challenges around things like data privacy and cybersecurity, you can actually use M&A in order to be able to get these capabilities.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your answer. It appeals to me that in your book, you mentioned that while digital tools are transforming M&A, human judgment and relationships remain essential for success. And over the past decades, we see that there are quite a lot of failed M&A deals. But which failed deals do you think that turned out to be fortunate for the company or industry involved, and why?
That is, of course, a fascinating and important question. And the title of the book is The Deal Paradox. And of course, the paradox is that the more important the digital becomes, the more important the things that can't be digitized are as well. So there is that human element that is going to be entirely necessary, throughout the process. And that's not going to, in any of our lifetimes, either mine or even yours that will be longer, will be critical. But you've asked us specifically about some deals. I think that a good deal in that regard would be thinking about Facebook when they didn't do the deal to buy Snapchat. back in 2013. I think that they missed out on buying them, but because they missed out on it, they realized they had to develop the capability internally. Think back to that deal, okay? They wanted to have Snapchat. It was very, very popular, and they wanted to buy the company. But when they were unable to buy the company, when they failed at doing the M&A deal, it forced them to hire the people and to develop it internally. And they developed something called Instagram Stories. And ultimately, that did undermine some of Snapchat's growth, and it really did secure a lot of the dominant position of Facebook. But that's actually a tech deal doing a tech deal. Let me think of another deal, and that would be GE's failed bid for Honeywell. Now, this one was a long time ago, and it was blocked for regulatory issues. It actually was approved in the US, and it was rejected by the regulators in Europe. GE had to unwind the deal because they had already started integrating back in the US. But it was a very, very complex integration. And integration is where the test of any deal really comes, because that's where you're going to have success or not success. And ultimately, by not buying Honeywell, they were able to walk away from a deal, or they had to walk away from a deal that would have been almost impossible to integrate, would have been very distracting from a business perspective. And again, I think that they were quite happy ultimately not to have done that deal.
Yeah, thank you very much for your vivid examples. We see that benefiting from the rapid development of globalization, the past M&A globally, leading to the emergence of industry giants in almost all sectors. But today, against the backdrop of rising trade protectionism and the failure of multilateral mechanism, where do you think such globalized M&A activities are headed? And could M&A potentially become a force in reconstructing the global economic governance system?
That is a fascinating question, and obviously a very timely question on that. And it is true. What I would even call anti-globalization wave is having quite an effect on M&A deal activity, because for a very long time, at least for the last 20 years, cross-border deals, have been all the rage. Even Peking, when you think about it, back about 10 years ago from where we are today, as companies were looking to expand into new geographic markets, acquiring foreign competitors, building up their global supply chains, and basically contributing to the globalization trend. And now what do we have? We have rising trade protectionism, we've got economic nationalism, we've got governments that are using regulations in order to be able to stop deals. We've had governments being cautious about allowing foreign takeovers in certain strategic industries like semiconductors and AI and energy and so on. And I guess it would be very, very tempting to be quite negative about that. But I actually think, in looking at this, it's not that globalization is dead. I think it's just evolving into something different. So whereas in the past you might acquire a competitor to have a position in a particular market, now what we're doing is we're seeing more partnerships where companies are working together but not necessarily acquiring each other. I like to think of M&A as not just being about acquiring other companies, but you can also in that include strategic partnerships and joint ventures and so on. And we are seeing that. We're seeing regional supply chains growing up as opposed to global supply chains. And I think that companies are looking for ways to be able to reduce their risk through M&A in a way that doesn't necessarily contribute to globalization, but does enable them to be better global competitors. So yes, I think that there has been quite a bit of backlash on the trend to globalization. It is a pendulum, and pendulums swing from one side to the other. It wouldn't surprise me if once we get past this particularly difficult period for globalization, we'll see some of that coming back. But I think it is globalization in a different way that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, thank you very much for your answer. And the last question is about ESG ratings because we know that ESG has become more and more important in relating to the company's development. So, do you think that companies nowadays with low ESG ratings are becoming abandoned targets in M&A? And have you encountered any cases where deals were terminated due to ESG risks?
Well, let me take the second part of the question first, just on that, because it's always fun talking about examples here. ESG factors do stop deals. I think it's very, very important to break up ESG into environmental, social, and governance because they are very different, and my preference is to talk about them differently. But I think many people still put that all into one bundle, and indeed, there was last year a survey by Deloitte, that surveyed 500 M&A corporate leaders, and they found that 70% of them said that they had abandoned acquisitions because of ESG concerns. That's a huge figure. And then just to give you an example, you could again look last year at the mining giants Rio Tinto and Glencore, and together they had proposed doing a deal that would have created the world's largest mining company. But there was a lot of pushback on that deal. Why? Because Rio Tinto had actually gone ESG more than Glencore did. Rio Tinto had actually said that they, and did, exit from their coal operations, for example, but Glencore continued to profit from the whole coal mining activities that they were doing, and indeed we're talking about expanding those activities. That's a great cultural difference. They had tried to put the two companies together, and I wouldn't say necessarily that ESG stopped the deal from taking place, but it was the fact that both companies had a very, very different take on ESG that meant that culturally they probably would not have been able to work together. So in some sense, ESG stopped that deal without it explicitly stopping the deal, in the same way that perhaps Deloitte actually might have been talking about it like that. But to get to the first part of your question, yes, I do think that companies with poor environmental records, with weak governance, with labor issues, so covering any one of those E, S, or G categories, are going to be interesting for maybe some buyers on turnaround situations. But most buyers would not be interested in taking on the challenges that happen when you have the reputational baggage of poor environment, weak governance, or bad labor, for example. And indeed, in some places in the world, regulators are making it very difficult to get those kinds of deals done. Now, there is some backlash on that as well, and I think that we're seeing some trends in some countries to move away from explicitly stopping the ESG hurdle for deals taking place. But that isn't going to change the management, the shareholder, the employee, and the other pressures in order to be able to be good on issues relating to the environment, good on issues relating to governance, good on issues relating to social activity, and so on. So I see ESG being an issue. I think it will probably look more like what Deloitte found than it would be that deals will start going through because the ESG concerns, in some countries at least, are changing.